Hello, everyone. My name is Sarita Chiu, and I study biology at Smith College. And today I'm going to talk about the effect of El Niño and the Blob on kelp canopy area in the Santa Barbara Channel. So the giant kelp Macrocystis pyrifera is a foundation species found in the temperate coasts. So they form really thick forests which provide habitat and food to a variety of organisms, including our favorite sea otter, fish, and a lot of invertebrates. And so they're really important in local fishing industries as well as in food processing. So we can see a lot of kelp forests along the coast of California. And the reason for this is that there's a lot of upwelling on these sites. And so upwelling brings up cool, nutrient-rich waters up to the kelp, which allow them to thrive in these areas. So you can see over here, these are the sites for upwelling in blue. So these are all the cool waters where you can find kelp. And so there are several factors which affect kelp recruitment, growth, and survival. So that includes sunlight, of course, nutrients, wave action, and competition. But for my project, I focused on wave action and temperature as a proxy for nutrients. And so studies have already been done on kelp and factors affecting nutrient availability. So that includes Kavanaugh's paper from 2011 and Caitlin Zigner's SARP project from 2015. So you might be wondering why I'm looking into this again. Has anything interesting happened since then? And so the answer to that is yes, there has been 2 thermal anomalies in the past couple of years. So the first one is El Niño from 2015 to 2016, and then we have the famous Blob from 2014 to 2015. And so the blob is just basically a blob of warm water in the Pacific Ocean. And this was caused by a really resilient atmospheric high pressure system, so intense that it was called the ridiculously resilient ridge. Super creative. And so it formed right about here. And what it did is that it kind of blocked storms from coming into this area. And so what happened is that all of the warm water kind of accumulated over here, which eventually formed the blob that lasted for about a year. And so we've seen a lot of El Niños, in the past, but this is really the first time we've seen anything like the blob. And so I was really excited to see how this all affected the kelp canopy area in the Santa Barbara Channel. And since a couple of years have passed since then, I was also curious to see how the kelp has improved over the years or recovered from these thermal anomalies. So I chose the Santa Barbara Channel as my area of interest because there are a lot of really big kelp beds in this area that is easily seen in satellite imagery. And so I used the Landsat 5 and Landsat 7 satellite imagery to look at this area from 1997 up until 2017 with 2 images per year for a total of 42 images. So once I downloaded all my atmospherically corrected Landsat data, I layer stacked them on ENVI and then put masks to block out the areas that I was not interested in, and I just focused on the coastline where the kelp was. I then put ROIs, or regions of interest, where I knew kelp beds were, and then I did the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or the NDVI, in these regions of interest. So the NDVI is just basically a band ratio which compares near infrared to red bands, and it uses this equation, and it just gives us a number that estimates the health of the vegetation in those areas. And so I use this as a proxy to estimate the kelp canopy area. And once I did that for all 42 of my images, I was able to do a really neat time series. So now that I had my kelp data, I wanted to compare it to a variety of other things, including wave height, because really big waves have the capacity to really ruin kelp forests and tear through their canopies. So I got this data from Goleta Point Station from NOAA, right at our study site. And as I've touched on before, water temperature can be used as a proxy for nutrients, and so that's very important, and I definitely needed that data. So I got that from the Ocean Observing System buoy in Stearns Wharf, which is a little bit east to our study site, but it's close enough. Of course, I wanted to see how kelp related to El Niño, because El Niño brings warm water and kind of messes up the upwelling in my study area, right about here. And so to do this, I looked at the Oceanic Niño Index, or the ONI from NOAA, which is an index which monitors the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or the ENSO. And so the ENSO has a warm face, El Niño, which kind of brings the really warm sea surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific, while La Niña does the opposite. So I also looked at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the PDO. So what this is basically the first dominant mode of sea surface height anomalies. And I also looked at Kelp and the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, or the NPGO, which is the second dominant mode of sea surface height anomaly. So these are all indices that focus on the northern Pacific Ocean, and they affect other things such as sea surface temperature, wind patterns, and pressure. So now that I had all of my data, I could make all my plots to compare them to each other. And so first, I compared Kelp with the Oceanic Niño Index, and I put an asterisk during the periods where we had El Niño events. And for ease of understanding, I put a rectangle where the blob was and El Niño, and that's where they all overlap. And so the way that the ONI affects the California current is pretty binary. So it's either you have El Niño or you don't. So overall, there is no correlation between ONI and the Kelp. But once the ONI reaches a certain threshold and gets labeled as El Niño, then we always see a dip in the canopy areas over there. So next, I looked at Kelp and water temperature, and as expected, they have a really strong negative correlation. Again, warmer water holds less nutrients, and so that's really bad for the Kelp. And you can see here, when there are elevated sea surface temperature heights, there is a drop in the Kelp canopy area. Next, I look at Kelp and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Again, this is the first dominant mode of sea surface height, but I did not see any correlation between these two. And then I looked at the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, which is the second most dominant mode of sea surface height. Now, in this paper by Kavanaugh in 2011, they found a 3-year lag between these two things, but unfortunately, I didn't find a correlation. And I think this is because my time series just goes back 20 years, while Kavanaugh's goes back, I don't know, up until the 80s, I believe, or 70s even. And so lastly, I looked at Kelp and wave height. And so this is a really complicated graph, but it really shows us a lot of interesting things. And so if you see it as a whole, the data set doesn't really show any correlation between Kelp and wave height. But if we divide it into two parts, then we see some pretty interesting things. So on the left shows 2004 up to 2011 with a negative correlation. So during this period, we had some really large wave height anomalies, as you can see over here, which were probably caused by storms in the wintertime. And these possibly just ripped through Kelp and kind of destroyed the canopy area, which is why there's probably negative correlation. But the interesting thing is, from 2011 up until the present, we can see a really, really strong positive correlation over here. And here we don't see the same giant big wave peaks. And we're not really sure about this, but we think that there's probably a threshold that waves have to get over to actually have a height that's big enough to damage kelp canopy. And so look, if you compare these waves to this, you can see that these are kind of smaller, and these probably didn't really do a lot of harm to the kelp. And it's also kind of interesting to note that during this time is when these thermal anomalies kind of kicked in and affected the nutrient availability in the Santa Barbara Channel. And so the nutrients were pretty low, and the smaller waves might have actually benefited the kelp by kind of churning the water and distributing the nutrients fairly well. And, but the caveat to all of this is that the timing that we got our images is pretty unequal, and so that's just a problem that we had because of image availability in the Landsat. So I couldn't take the same images from the same months, and so this is what we had to work with. And it's also important to note that the ONI kind of shows up in these wave patterns. So to conclude, the ONI maxima corresponds to observed kelp minima, which makes sense because once the ONI reaches the threshold, it really affects the California current and makes it a lot warmer. And so as expected, the water temperature and kelp canopy show a strong negative correlation. And so in the beginning of my project, I was really expecting the kelp not to do so well because of the blob and El Niño kind of going back to back, and these thermal anomalies likely really damage the kelp. But surprisingly, although there was a big drop over here, they are recovering quite well. And so that was a happy surprise because look how well they are doing right now. So they appear to respond really well after thermal anomalies. So finally, the relationship between kelp and wave height appears really complex, and there looks to be trade-offs between wave-driven mixing, winter storm canopy destruction, and possible correlative effects with ONI. And with that, I'd like to thank our wonderful mentor, Henry, and our awesome advisor, Rafael Cadella, Dr. Rafael Cadella, and of course, the super-duper awesome Dr. Emily Schaller, and Dave for helping me with my envy, and of course, NASA SARP and ENSO.